The Pathans by Olaf Caroe. Chapter 7. Arab Expansion. After the defeat of the Hephthalites, or Haytal, by Sassanian Persia, aided by the Turks, in the year AD 568, the northwest frontier region, as far as the Indus and including Gandhara, had become once more an appendage of the Sassanians. For 11 centuries, from the time of Darius onward, it had been the outpost of Persia towards India, successively under Achaemenian, Parthian and Sassanian rulers, while the nomadic invaders also, the Bactrians, Sakas and Kushans, are to be counted as having been of Iranian stock. More recently, it had been overrun by the barbarian Hephthalites from the further north. These, like the invaders before them, abode their destined hour and went their way as sultans, but left a deep mark on the population. And even these Hephthalites seem to have been subject to Iranian influence and were unable to impose their language on the people. This inclusion in the Iranian world for a millennium before the advent of Islam is an historical fact of the deepest significance. Persian civilization is much older than Islamic or indeed Christian influences, and is moreover of a notable endurance. It is not surprising, therefore, that Islam, as it reached the non-Arab countries, from Anatolia to the Oxus and Indus valleys, passed through a Persian prism. It overcame and gradually submerged those northern lands, but was not able entirely to assimilate them, or perhaps it would be nearer the truth to say that the ancient culture radiating from Khurasan, not a desert civilization, turned the new thought into well-worn channels. The Iranian spirit and atmosphere that is still so evident around Peshawar is thus attributable to influences far older than Islamic, influences brought to bear by many kings and courts over more than 1,000 years. But this had been the Persian frontier towards the east, and as such has been continuously exposed to Indian influences also. For 1 century in this millennium, the century after the passing of Alexander, the region had formed a part of the Mauryan Empire of India, 323 to 190 BC, and had become a well-known centre of the Buddhist cult. Later, in the 2nd century after Christ, Kanishka, the Kushan emperor, gave new life to the Buddhist faith and made possible the great Buddhist Renaissance, which produced not only Gandhara art, but even the Mahayana, the greater vehicle itself. And, as the name Vasudeva shows, the last monarchs of the Kushan dynasty had yielded to Brahmanism. It may well have been this reversion to Indian influences that spurred the first Sassanian kings, Ardashir and Shapur, to reassert the sway of Persia and Persian ideas in this frontier region, thus anticipating the later missionary zeal of the first Muslims. At the end of the 6th Christian century, it seemed that the Persian influence had returned in triumph. The smashing of the Hephthalite power by Khusrau Anushirvan in 568 was followed by what seemed even more startling successes under Khusrau II, 590 to 628, who captured Antioch, Damascus and Jerusalem, marched and countermarched through Egypt, and in the north took Ankara, and even reached the Bosphorus opposite Byzantium. Under this monarch, the Persian state was repeating Achaemenian triumphs, and must have appeared to Byzantine Rome quite as formidable as had Darius or Xerxes to the Greeks. But it was the false brightness before storm. Under Heraclius, the Byzantines were able to launch a vigorous counterattack. Asia Minor and Armenia were liberated from the Persian yoke, and Heraclius in his turn appeared before the Persian winter capital at Ctesiphon. Khusrau II fell, assassinated by his own son, born of a Byzantine princess. The date was 628, 6 years after the Hijrat, the flight of the Prophet Muhammad to Medina, and 4 years before the Prophet's death. This war shook Sassanian Persia to its foundations. During the 14 years between the death of Khusrau II and the accession of the last Sassanian, Yasgard III, no less than a dozen kings succeeded one another on the throne. The army got out of hand, and the royal princes became pawns, crowned only to be assassinated. Military leaders attempted to seize the throne, and almost all the Sassanids themselves were exterminated. When a new king was needed, a prince of the royal blood had to be brought out of hiding at Stacha. But it was too late. The generals acted like the independent satraps of the later Achaemenids. The empire crumbled and became a collection of petty states. No effective organisation existed capable of opposing the Arab advance when it came a few years later. The Arab storm swept up. Ctesiphon fell after defeats in Mesopotamia, and in 642, the 21st Muslim year, in the plain of Nihawand, south of Hamadan, the final victory went to the Arabs. Yozgad, like Darius Kodomanus before him, fled to the east and met his death near Merv in 651. Arab, Turk, and Mongol were to walk as conquerors across the soil of western and eastern Iran, and some centuries were to pass before any part of this country was again to follow rulers not of foreign stock. But the ancient Iranian culture, rooted in the millennium that had passed, survived and profoundly influenced its conquerors. The impact of Islam when it reached the Indus and the Oxus valleys can only be understood against this background. Iran was able to take captivity captive. The effect of the overthrow of the Sassanids on the eastern borderlands was in one sense more profound, and certainly more complex, than the fate which befell the metropolitan provinces of the Persian Empire. Much is slurred over, for the Arab writers do not allude in detail to reverses, or to regions where the Arab onrush met a barrier, or bypassed difficult ground. Given the rise of Islam, the expectation would be that our sources would forthwith multiply and the picture clear. That hope is belied, and in fact, the 4 centuries between the disappearance of the White Huns and the rise of the Ghaznavids under Sabuktargin are among the darkest of all ages upon the frontier. Such early chronicles as exist are on the whole well borne out by coins, and the best are given in a footnote. Identifications on the whole are few, the reason being that, quite contrary to the general impression, and in direct refutation of Pathan legend, the advent of Islam to our region was actually delayed for about 4 centuries, and was very slow and halting, even in the mountain massif of what is now called Afghanistan. When in the early centuries the Arabs did break into the Kabul Valley or towards the Indus, it was only as ephemeral raiders, fighting against native princes who are either referred to as idolaters or specified as Hindus. Even Kabul was not conquered by Muslim leaders till late in the 9th century, while Gandhara and the plains districts along the Indus remained under the Hindushahiya dynasty until the time of Mahmud of Ghazni early in the 11th century. Vincent Smith briefly sums up what happened by saying simply that, after the White Huns, there was no effective invasion of India for 500 years. To this broad truth there is one qualification: the Arab conquest of Sind early in the 8th century AD, but that is outside this story. There are many summaries of the conquests of Islam which give an impression so simplified as to be utterly misleading. An example now before me describes what is now Afghanistan as having been divided between the Umayyads and local chiefs between 661 and 749, after which it was loosely held by the Abbasids until 869 when the Saffarids took over. Afghanistan, this survey adds, was converted very early. As we shall see, it is not so, even as regards Afghanistan, much less Gandhara. In fact, the native princes, who were not Muslims in the east or northeast, enjoyed a firmer, longer, and less precarious tenure than the local representatives of the various Muslim dynasties which claimed the allegiance of the eastern Iranian provinces up to the time of Mahmud of Ghazni. Even when we reach Mahmud, it will be found that as late as the 11th century, 400 years after the Prophet, the Afghans, who had by then appeared clearly in the record, are not by any means all of the Muslim faith. In a word, the real picture differs entirely from that painted by the genealogists to portray the conversion of the Afghans in the time of the Prophet. For greater comfort, let it be understood that it is seldom the earliest converts who are the most devoted to a faith. The earliest authentic visitor to Gandhara, of whom we have record after the beginning of the Islamic era, is the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, who toured Peshawar and Swat in 644 and found Buddhism on the wane and Brahmanism in the ascendant. This is 2 years after the decisive victory which the Arab armies won over Sassanian Persia at Nihawand, but there is no sign or mention of the new wind in the record of the Chinese pilgrim. What had happened in the eastern confines of the Sassanian Empire was the replacement of a centralized Persian domination by a reassertion of Brahmanism from India, and this is one reason why we know so little of what happened in the next 4 centuries. The Hindus wrote no history and cared nothing for chronology. We are driven back on coins, eked out with references by early Arab chroniclers to sporadic raids, east and northeast along 2 axes, operating from Fars by way of Kerman. The first axis was through Nishapur to Herat, Merv and Balkh, Bactria, the second by way of Sistan, then known as Sijistan, to the Helmand and Bust, now ruined, at the confluence of the Helmand and the Arghandab. Kandahar, the city, does not appear in any of the old chronicles and is known to have been a later foundation. I will deal with the 2 lines of Arab advance separately. The first axis never reached south of the main wall of the Hindu Kush. Kabul and the central Afghan massif, now the Hazarajat and then called Ghor, remained untouched by it. Because this advance resulted in the conquest of Persian Khurasan and Mawarana, Transoxiana, it has sometimes been wrongly assumed that it was by this way that the Arabs reached the headwaters of the Indus Valley. The sequence of events was in fact quite different. Operating from Kerman in Persia, Abdallah ibn Amr entered Persian Khurasan across the desert of the Dashti Lut and from a headquarters at Nishapur in 650, H30, or soon after captured Herat, Merv and Balkh. 5 years later occurred the murder of the Caliph Uthman and the civil strife among the Arabs associated with Ali's caliphate. Ali sent a number of governors to represent him in Khurasan, but disorder continued until Muawiyah succeeded in establishing the Umayyad dynasty at Damascus in 661, H41. A succession of undistinguished Umayyad governors followed, few of them lasting more than a year or 2, and all mainly interested in carrying the arms of Islam across the Oxus. Not one ventured east from Herat or south from Balkh. In 680, H.61, began a 10-year strife between the Umayyad representative Salm and one Abdallah ibn Qasim, who supported the anti-Caliph Abdallah ibn Zubayr. The conflict within the caliphate, reflected in Khurasan, was not resolved until the succession of the great Caliph Abd al-Malik, 685 to 705, H.66 to 86, under whom Ibn Qasim was killed in battle near Merv in 691, H.72. In 705, H.86, came the appointment of the memorable governor Qutayba ibn Muslim, who effected the conquest of Transoxiana as far as Khwarazm and Samarkand. But he too came to grief after the accession of the Caliph Suleiman in 714, H.96. He had been a personal enemy of Suleiman's before that caliph's accession and plotted to rebel. His Arab troops rose against him and he was killed in 715, H.97. All his successors were ephemeral until in 750, H.133, the Umayyads gave way to the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad. The Arab conquest of Khurasan, Balkh and Mawarana, Transoxiana on this northern axis did not directly touch on our region, but it has some bearing on the Suleiman Mountains and the Indus insofar as the Arabs, by providing a northern Muslim base, opened the way for the influx of the Turkish chieftains, slaves and soldiers who bulked so large in the history of India right up to the time of the Mughal Empire. Under the Samanids, an Islamized dynasty of Iranian origin from Balkh, which succeeded to the Abbasid power on the Oxus and ruled in the 3rd and 4th Islamic centuries. 874 to 999. Turkish slaves established the Ghaznavid dynasty, which under Sabuktagin and his son Mahmud opened the Punjab to Muslim invasion and control. But this was to come centuries later. The Arabs did not effectively subjugate either Kabul or Ghazni, much less any part of the Sulayman mountain area. Such penetration as was effected under Arab command towards the Indus Valley was on the other axis through Sistan. It is to be described as in the order of raiding only, though at times the raids were formidable and on a considerable scale. When Abdallah ibn Amr reached Kerman on his way from Fars towards Khurasan, as already related, he detached a force under al-Rabi ibn Ziyad against Sijistan. In 651, H31, Ibn Ziyad entered Zaranj, situated on the lower Helmand near its entry into the inland Hamun, which forms that river's debouchement, and then the chief city of the region. Here he made his headquarters on a site which had probably been the Zranka of the Achaemenian inscriptions, and was later to become one of the Ghaznavid citadels in the west of their empire. It is situated just within modern Afghan territory, at a place now known as Nad Ali on the Helmand Delta. After 2 years, Ibn Ziyad was displaced and the Arab conquest wavered, the new provinces like Khurasan remaining in an unsettled state owing to the succession disputes within Iraq, arising over the Caliphate of Ali. With the establishment of the Umayyad Caliphate under Muawiyah in 661, H41, there came a notable advance. The new governor, Abdurrahman ibn Samura, took Bust, the then great city at the junction of the Helmand and Arghandab, together with Zamindawar, the fertile open valley north of Bust on the southern skirts of the mountain massif of Ghor. Bust, like Zaranj, is now a ruin and has been replaced by Girishk, 25 miles distant. But Zamindawar remains as the metropolitan district of the Abdalis, Duranis, just as the northern part of the Peshawar plain is that of the Yusufzais. It is interesting that neither at this time nor indeed for another 1,000 years is there any mention of the great Abdali tribe. Having taken Bust, Ibn Samura and his successor Ibn Ziyad, who had also been his predecessor, went on to make expeditions to Zabul, Kabul and Ar-Rukaj. Kabul we know. Ar-Rukaj corresponds to the classical Arachosia and covers more or less the province of Kandahar. Zabul has varied interpretations. The early Arab chroniclers seem to mean by it the region which is now the lower Hazarajat between the Helmand, Arghandab and Tarnak rivers, but Babur describes it as the country south of Ghazni towards Mukur. In this period there were 2 rulers against whom the Arabs from Sijistan were pitted. The first, an hereditary line known by the title Rutbil or Zunbil, and the second, the Kabul Shah. Both are clearly unbelievers and both remain unsubdued, although the chroniclers record temporary successes against them. Ibn Samura is said to have fought his way into Kabul in 663, H43, but 3 years later Ibn Ziyad arrived in Zaranj to find both the Kabul Shah and the Rutbil in open revolt and in control of the country as far south as Bust. Inconclusive fighting followed with Rutbil and a treaty was made. In 664 H44 occurs what is to us much the most interesting item in a barren narrative. In that year, Al-Muhallab ibn Abi Sufra, a lieutenant of Ibn Samura, raided as far as Banna and Al-Awar, towns between Al-Multan and Kabul, where he was attacked by 18 Turkish knights. This is the earliest reference in any Muslim record to localities on the frontier which are identifiable today. We shall not be rash in equating Banna with Bannu, situated directly between Multan and Kabul, and, after Peshawar, the most fertile tract below the Sulayman Mountains and the most worth raiding. Al-Awar is even more interesting. One manuscript of Al-Baladuri reads Lahor for Al-Awar, a trifling variation in the Arabic script. There can be no doubt, I think, that the reference is to the site near the present village of Lahore, in the neighbourhood of Hund, in the Yusufzai Samar of Peshawar. This village, which I know well, is 4 miles inland from the Indus at the Hund ford, and is surrounded by 5 very large mounds, one of which stands 50 feet above the plain. There are also 4 or 5 other mounds, almost as large, 2 miles distant and south of the next village of Jalsai. This surely is the place to be equated with this early Arab raid. It can be described as lying on one road from Kabul to Multan via the Peshawar Valley. I think it very possible also that this Lahore, and not the Punjab city, was the one mentioned by Farishta in the introduction to his history as the capital of Jaipal, the Hindushahiya ruler defeated by Mahmud of Ghazni, and even that the Hind or Waihind, to which the Hindushahis at one time removed, was not at the present Hund. Hund is right on the riverbank and is built within a small fort. It is too exposed to have ever been a capital and must have served as a strong point at the ford head. There are no big mounds there to show the ruins of an old city. The capital itself would have been at a point secure from floods, 4 miles inland from the river, and situated where the great mounds stand around Lahore. It is even conceivable that the greater Lahore on the Ravi was named after this now obscure village near the Indus. The 18 Turkish knights of Lahore would have been Haytal, the Ephthalite ancestors of the present Khans of Hund and Zaida. There can be no doubt that systematic excavation of the mounds around this site will add a rich harvest to our knowledge of this period. A few years later, another Sijistan Arab governor, Abd ibn Ziyad, raided the frontier of Al-Hind and crossed the desert to Al-Kandar, where he put the inhabitants to flight but incurred heavy casualties. This was in 672, H53. The Kandar mentioned is not the city now written Kandahar. That city was not at that time known at any rate by this name, but Gandhara. That this is so is made clear by later references in Al-Biruni, writing in the time of Mahmud of Ghazni in the 11th century. Al-Biruni speaks of Hindu kings who ruled in Kabul and Kandar with its capital at Waihind, the modern Hund, or, as I interpret here, Lahore close to Hund. The identity of this earlier Kandar of the Arab writers is clinched by yet another passage in Al-Biruni, who, quoting an itinerary from the Punjab to Kabul, writes, "And to Jhelum on the west of the water of Beata, the Jhelum river, is 8 farsakhs, and to Waihind, the capital of Kandar, on the west of the water of Sindh, the Indus, is 20 farsakhs, and to Peshawar, is 14 farsakhs." This early entry into Kandar, the Peshawar Valley, was but a raid and of no permanent significance. A little later, 3-cornered strife broke out between the Umayyad caliphs of Damascus, the Zubayrids of Arabia and Iraq, and the Kharijites, who held for a while both coasts of the Persian Gulf. All fought against all, the Zubayrids and the Kharijites setting up anti-caliphs. Sides were changed, and even the lieutenants of the main parties rebelled against their chiefs. During this time, which lasted from circa 685, H.66, to the fall of the Umayyads in 750, H.133, the energies, even of the great Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik, 685 to 705, were too much turned towards the maintenance of the dynasty against rival claimants to make possible any planned extension of Muslim domination beyond Sijistan to the east. In 685, Rutbil, or Ranthal, is strong enough to confine the Arab governor to the citadel of Zaranj. This Rutbil is killed but succeeded by an equally formidable ruler of the same designation. A Sijistan governor is defeated by him and consequently dismissed by Abd al-Malik. Another, Obaidallah, made an attack on Kabul in 698 H79, ending in a disaster and his death. He was followed by Abdurrahman ibn Muhammad in the next year. Abdurrahman began by making some progress against Rutbil, but quarrelled with his superior al-Hajjaj and rebelled. It has been common form to speak of this Abdurrahman as having captured Kabul in 699. What actually took place is that after defeat at the hands of al-Hajjaj, from whom he had rebelled, he was driven to take refuge in Kabul with Rutbil, by whom he was put to death in 704, H.85, in consequence of a demand by al-Hajjaj. Al-Hajjaj himself seems to have been able for a while to exact an uncertain tribute from this Rutbil, but embarked on no decisive campaign against him. With the gradual decline in the power of the dynasty after the death of the Caliph Abd al-Malik, the later Umayyad governors were able only to retain a precarious hold on Zaranj itself. The Abbasids of Baghdad who succeeded them were no more successful in this direction than their Umayyad predecessors, if anything less so. Under al-Mamun, who acceded in 813, H. 198, that date there is a record that al-Mamun, apparently before his accession while he was governor in Khurasan, had extended postal services across the Hindu Kush from the north as far as Kabul. But the Kabul Shahs remained undisturbed, and Muslim rule did not become effective or direct in this region until after the rise of the Saffarids in the 9th century of our era. I have given this somewhat bald recital from original Muslim sources to establish how completely untrue it is to suppose that the people of Gandhara and the surrounding mountain regions were swept into the Muslim fold at an early period of the Islamic era. The general picture, on the contrary, is that during the first 2 Islamic centuries, Arab control, except in Sind, was never effectively extended over any part of what had been the eastern provinces of the Sassanian Empire. South of the Hindu Kush, the Arab frontier was never much further advanced than Herat and Bust, and even there was confined to the main lines of communication, tenuous and often intermittent. Considerable kingdoms under non-Muslim rulers maintained at any rate a de facto independence in Zabulistan and Kabul, into which Arab penetration was confined to raids and occasional demands for tribute. Coins assignable to these kingdoms are known, although they have not been satisfactorily interpreted. The Arabs reached the Kabul area, and even at an early period the banks of the Indus near Lahore in Gandhara. They also once raided Bannu, but east of the Helmand there was no occupation. The 2 arms of the Arab advance, the northerly axis towards Samarkand and the southerly axis through Sijistan, left central Afghanistan and, to a large extent, the Kabul-Ghazni area almost untouched. Their inhabitants, variously referred to as Turks or Haytal, were at most vaguely tributary and certainly not fully converted. In Kabul and Zabulistan resided non-Muslim kings whose line more than once defeated Arab attacks and took Arab governors prisoner. The identity of the constantly recurring and enigmatic Rutbil, Zunbil or Ranthel presents a challenge. At different times he is presented as king of Ar-Rukaj, the modern Kandahar, of Zabulistan, from Ghazni south and westward, and even of Kabul. The Muslim chroniclers invariably look on their opponents in this region as Turks or Haytal, and as we have seen, there are good grounds for connecting the Haytal with the Khalaj. It is tempting by a process of induction to see in this Rutbil a forerunner of Mirwais, leader of the great Galgi confederacy of the 18th century. In the Upper Kabul Valley itself, there exists no documentary evidence, and at present no identifiable coinage to establish the exact affinities of the Shahs who ruled there during the first 2 Islamic centuries. Vincent Smith speaks of the Turkishahiya kings, a cadet branch of the Kushans, as ruling over both Kabul and Gandhara until the rise of the Saffarids in the 9th century. Thereafter, they seem to have shifted their capital from Kabul, which was captured by the first Safarid, and moved to Waihind on the Indus, the site I have identified with the Gandharan Lahore. Here they appear as the Hindushahiya dynasty, of whom there is more to say. The religion of these non-Muslim potentates seems to have been originally Buddhism, but fast reverting to Hinduism. That Buddhism was powerful in the valleys of the Hindu Kush long after Kanishka is known from the Bamiyan idols, but it is probable that, much as in modern Nepal, it was fighting a losing battle against the Brahmins, finding its adherents pushed further and further back into the mountains. Nearer to India, as in Gandhara, we know from Xuanzang that rulers and people were fast reverting to Hinduism as early as 644. Long before the time of the Ghaznavids, from 960 on, the ruling creed, at any rate around Peshawar, had become a strict Brahminical Hinduism. It remains to notice one important aspect of the gradual Arab expansion eastward before the time when Muslim rulers could overcome the local Iranian or Kushan dynasties who had adopted Buddhism or Hinduism. It is obvious that, as the Muslim power and influence gradually spread from Sijistan and Balkh, considerable colonies of Arabs and other Muslims from Arabia, Iraq, Syria, and no doubt Persia also settled themselves or were settled by the governors among the indigenous peoples. The Arabs of the Hejaz, of course, carried the greatest prestige among the exponents of the new religion. While discussing the Bani Israel theory, we noticed the existence of groups of Sayyids and others to whom there still attaches a reputation for past or present sanctity or piety. There are many such up and down the frontier region. At least 5 groups of Sayyid families reside in Peshawar itself. There is another well-known Sayyid family at Ismaila in the Yusufzai Sama, another at Batgram in the Doaba, another connected with the Pir Baba shrine in Buna, another at the village of Jarman near Kohat, yet another at Paniala under the Sheikh Buddin Hill in the north of the Derajat. Nor are these the only ones. The claim is that all Sadat are descended from the Prophet by the union of his daughter Fatima with Ali. Whether any or all of these groups can actually establish so noble an ancestry may be uncertain. But this, I think, is beyond dispute. These people, whether or not they are of the blood of the Prophet himself, are certainly the descendants of Arab colonists or missionaries who came to these parts in the early Islamic centuries, partly to propagate the faith and partly to assist in the onward march of conquest. In addition to the Sadat, there are many others: Mians, Akhundzadas, Sahibzadas, Quraysh, and so on, the descendants of pious men of repute. Except for the Quraysh, who claim to belong to the Prophet's tribe, there is no reason to suppose that the ancestors of these others were Arabs. Many of them, if not all, must have been of Persian, Turkey, or Pathan origin. Any of them who were Arab quickly lost their Arabic as a living tongue, though no doubt they preserved it for intoning the Quran. They took wives from among the families in the indigenous population who embraced the new faith and became, in a very real sense, the spokesmen and leaders of the people. They constitute a notable strain in the origins of the population of these parts. Even today, their prestige is a living thing, and people will reverently kiss a Sayyid's hand. Yet, however genuine the claim to Arab forebears, it remains true that Islam, as it reached the countries previously subjected to Iranian influence, passed through a Persian prism. In their effort to assimilate the people of the frontier to Islamic thought and idea, these Sadat had themselves to become adapted to that older Persian culture, which their converts had known for 1,000 years and more before the coming of Islam.